The 2021 Volkswagen ID.4 is quite simply one of the most important new cars launched in the US for the 2021 model year, and one of the most important EVs as well. This is launching at almost exactly the same time as the Ford Mustang Mach-E, which you could see as a direct competitor, but Volkswagen and Ford are going after ever so slightly different audiences. With the ID.4, Volkswagen would like you to think of this as an alternative to a CR-V or a RAV4, whereas Ford is a little bit more closely trying to mimic what Tesla has done with the Model Y. According to Volkswagen, the average compact crossover shopper in 2021 is spending about $33,000 on their new vehicle. And that's the target price for the ID.4 after federal incentives. Remember that this does qualify for the full $7,500 tax credit, something that we don't see on the Chevy Bolt or, of course, any of Tesla's current lineup because their tax credits have expired. For that price, the ID.4 does come pretty well equipped. The LED headlights are standard, although not the ones that are on this particular model. If you get the upper end trims, then they do steer in the corners. The base models don't. Also optional is this little LED accent strip right there, and optionally an illuminated Volkswagen logo, which this model does not have. One of the first things I noticed about the ID.4 is that we don't have active grille shutters up front. This is the only cooling opening, because EVs don't require much cooling. But a lot of EVs and hybrids have active grille shutters to help improve aerodynamics. Unfortunately, they also increase costs, and as I'll talk about in this video, the ID.4 is certainly about keeping an EV affordable, both for Volkswagen and for you as a customer. So there are going to be a few things about the ID.4 that I'm not the biggest fan of, but the logical reason behind a lot of them is quite simply cost. At the moment, the ID.4 is built in Europe, but part of Volkswagen's strategy to make this affordable to buy and affordable to build for them is by building this in the United States. So coming later in 2021, ID.4 models will be assembled in the US from components from the US, from Europe, from all around the world. But at the moment, they are built in Europe. The other thing Volkswagen is certainly doing with the ID line of vehicles is trying to make them a direct competitor to a lot of the mainstream vehicles that you might want to cross-shop them with that aren't electric cars. So when it comes to active driver assistance technologies, this is incredibly well featured for the segment. Some options like the RAV4 and CR-V come standard with things like radar adaptive cruise control, but this has all of that standard and features that are optional on the competition as well, like blind spot monitoring with rear cross traffic detection and parking sensors, also auto high beams. The ID.4 has a ton of really nice design touches like the headlamp modules with this sort of Easter egg look, I guess you'd say. We also have the Volkswagen all-weather light integrated into the headlamp unit rather than a separate fog light below on the bumper. Now let's see how it measures up. At 180.5 inches long, this is almost exactly the same size as the RAV4. Again, Volkswagen's mission with the ID.4, they claim, was to make this an alternative to a RAV4 and CR-V, not necessarily directly chase Tesla or some of the other manufacturers that are going after that similar sort of vehicle shape. It's really noticeable back here in the cargo area, where we have a much less aerodynamic profile than we find in the Ford Mustang Mach-E. The Mach-E, the Tesla Model Y, they're all shaped like a Prius, to be perfectly honest, because that teardrop shape ends up being very aerodynamic, and that's why the Tesla crossovers look like sort of overinflated Tesla sedans. Now this is a case of give and take, because obviously aerodynamics are going to be lower with this general body profile, but on the other hand, we get a much more practical cargo area. As you'd expect in an EV, the wheels definitely have aerodynamics in mind, but a little bit unexpected for a mainstream vehicle is a staggered tire setup. We have 235 width tires up front, 255 width tires in the back. These tires are notably larger than the ones that we find on the Ford Mustang Mach-E, which again you could see as a direct competitor to this in the EV space, and also fairly wide for a mainstream compact crossover. Now there's a big reason for that. The ID.4 is fairly heavy. It has a pretty big battery pack underneath the vehicle, so this is hundreds of pounds heavier than the average compact crossover. Some of you might be wondering, why are the tires out back bigger than the tires up front? That's because this is a rear-wheel drive crossover, like the Mustang Mach-E. So if you're interested in a compact crossover with rear-wheel drive driving dynamics that won't break the bank, this is one of your only options. One of the advantages to the rear-wheel drive design is what we see here. No, I have not broken the front suspension of the ID.4. This is the wheel at maximum turn. This has a turning diameter of 33.6 feet. That is really, really small. There are subcompact crossovers in the US that have considerably larger turning circles than this ID.4. So if you live in the city and you want something that is a little bit larger in size, a little bit larger in accommodation on the inside, but still really easy to three-point turn, that could be the ID.4. Also surprising, although honestly not immediately obvious, is the ground clearance in the ID.4. This has considerably more ground clearance than the average electric crossover, 8.2 inches in the ID.4, and all-wheel drive is going to be available later in 2021. Importantly, not by the time you're watching this video, it's going to be a little bit later in the year. But something like the Ford Mustang Mach-E actually has less ground clearance than an actual Ford Mustang GT, even though theoretically it's supposed to be a Mustang crossover and the Mustang Coupe is supposed to be a sports car. We have a pretty modern look back here with the tail lamp modules. These are full LED units, and we have an accent light that runs right across from one side to the other, mimicking what we saw up front. As we see in many vehicles where efficiency is important, we have a spoiler right here on top of the hatch. The hatch itself hinges way back here, and then we have this sort of almost 2-foot long spoiler on top, and then the window curves way back in there. This design improves aerodynamics, but it does make the rear window a little bit difficult to clean. Also difficult to clean are some of these plastic sections right down here around the reflectors. If you're ID.4 shopping in Europe, you have the choice of 2 batteries and 3 different motor arrangements, rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. But in the United States, we're going to get just one battery, the larger one. It's an 82 kilowatt-hour lithium-ion battery pack. 77 kilowatt-hours of that is usable, giving this a range of 250 miles in the rear-wheel drive model. Obviously, the all-wheel drive model is going to be a little bit lower than that. The rear electric motor is rated for 201 horsepower and 229 pound-feet of torque. If you choose the dual motor option, everything bumps up quite a bit to 302 horsepower. So this is going to be quite a bit quicker if you choose the all-wheel drive option. Charging happens behind door number 1 on the passenger side. One little gripe that I have about EVs is that the charge port location is far from standardized. Sometimes it's back here, sometimes it's on the other side, on the driver's side, sometimes it's up front behind the front tires, and sometimes it's in the very front of the vehicle, which I have to say is my favorite location, but I don't live in an area that gets snow. So people that do live in an area that gets snow commonly complain about that particular charge port location. Anyway, back to the ID.4, we get a standard J1772 charging connector and a CCS DC fast charge port. If you plug this into a level 2 connector, you can charge at a maximum rate of 11 kilowatts. DC fast charging will get you up to 125. When DC fast charging, the peak rate of the ID.4 is a little bit lower than the peak rate in the big battery Mustang Mach-E, but most folks out there won't notice too much of a difference. You'll be able to go from 10% to 80% in under 40 minutes. Perhaps a bigger deal to most folks out there is that this continues to charge more rapidly than the Mustang once you hit 80%. So in the Mustang, when you hit 80%, the charge rate significantly drops. It's down to about 11 or 12 kilowatts. This continues charging at about double that until about 90%. So if you do need to squeak a few more electrons out of that charging stop, the ID.4 is going to be a bit quicker. When it comes to charging, I have one complaint that Volkswagen says will be addressed later this year, but I'm honestly surprised it was not addressed before they shipped us an ID.4 to review. If you take this vehicle to an Electrify America station, it does not support plug and charge yet. That's where you just plug it into the Electrify America station. You don't have to tap a card or use an app on your phone. It just recognizes the vehicle and automatically bills you. Volkswagen says that that feature will be available in the ID.4 later this year via a software update. But what bothers me about that is that Volkswagen owns Electrify America. This is Volkswagen's coast-to-coast charging network, very much like Tesla's Supercharge network. And for some reason, the ID.4 does not come with that support right off the bat. But it is something that we find in the Mustang Mach-E. So how is it that Ford beat Volkswagen to plug and charge on Volkswagen's own network? The world may never know. The reason the lack of that feature bugs me on the ID.4 is that this has one of the best features available in the EV segment at the moment: 3 years of free DC fast charging on the Electrify America network. If you're considering a new EV not just because of environmental concerns, but also because of cost of operation, this is a big deal, because the fuel for DC fast charging road trips is going to be essentially free, or just your regular top-off once a week. Maintenance costs are already significantly lower on the average EV than the average gasoline-powered vehicle. Charging at home is going to be less expensive than filling up with $3 a gallon gasoline, and this drives that average cost of operation even lower by being able to DC fast charge for free. Front seat comfort is excellent. Bear in mind that I am driving the top-end trim, which has a little bit more adjustment to the driver and front passenger seat than the base model. This one has a 4-way adjustable lumbar support and Volkswagen's front seat massage feature, 2-position seat memory for the driver and the front passenger. There's a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion, and as you can probably see, the instrument cluster moves with the steering wheel. Now, in case you're worried that all of the ID.4s have a white steering wheel, fear not, most ID.4s will actually have a black steering wheel. Even though the ID.4 is smaller on the outside than the Tiguan, on the inside we have about the same kind of legroom and very similar headroom to the average compact crossover as well. Now this model has the available large panoramic moonroof, but Volkswagen doesn't use it in quite the same way that Tesla and Ford do with their vehicles. Instead, as we'll take a look at in a bit, this is more traditionally shaped and traditionally oriented. So if I sit back in this passenger seat right here, my head is actually just above the non-glass portion of the roof. As we see in other electric vehicles, one benefit to the design is we have hardly any hump at all. There is a very slight one right there in the middle. I definitely have enough room to put 3 adults back here if I wanted to. And scooting all the way over to the right side where the front passenger seat is all the way back in its tracks, I still have about 4.5 inches of legroom left. Behind the available power hatch, we find 30.3 cubic feet of cargo capacity. That's about 7 cubic feet less than the Tiguan or the RAV4. On the other hand, this cargo area is about the same size as a Chevy Equinox, which is currently in the top 4 in sales in this segment in the US, and it's just about as square as the average compact crossover as well. This is significantly more useful than the average EV out there, even EV crossovers, because again, the teardrop shape that we find in most of those EV crossovers really compromises the cargo area. That was immediately obvious in my 24-inch roller bag test. Because of the squareness of this cargo area, I was able to fit 5 24-inch roller bags in here versus 4 in the Mustang Mach-E, even though that cargo area in the Mustang is almost as big, 29.7 cubic feet. As you'd expect out of Volkswagen, this vehicle is full of Euro-practical cargo touches, like a large cargo pass-through right there in the center seat position. We have a 60/40 folding rear seat back. We have a cargo area load floor with 2 different heights. We can raise it up right there. That makes it almost level with the cargo opening. You can also fold the load floor in half, stick it in the slot, and use it to divide the cargo area. Going all the way down the rabbit hole, we don't find a spare tire as you'd expect in an EV, but we do have somewhere to put your charge cord. Since the ID.4 is a new electric vehicle and a rear-wheel drive electric vehicle, you might think that there would be another trunk up front. But unfortunately, you would be mistaken. For some reason, Volkswagen has not given us one in the ID.4, and I do think that's a real pity. The hood in the ID.4 is an awful lot shorter than a lot of electric vehicles that give us front trunks, but when you take a look at what's under here, we have some HVAC stuff, we have a 12-volt battery, and then we have a radiator for some of the cooling systems, and of course the air conditioning. But that's exactly the same thing that we find in a wide variety of different EVs, and Volkswagen could have at least given us some room to store the charge cord. I love being able to put the charge cord in a front trunk like this rather than in the back cargo area, because if you've got the back full of cargo stuff, kids, toys, whatever, then it's a lot easier to pull the charge cord out of here than to unpack the cargo area and get that charge cord from the bottom. When it comes to my exclusive front trunk comfort index, obviously the ID.4 has to score a 0 out of 10 points. The model that I'm driving today is the first edition. This is actually pretty similar to the top-end version that most folks will be able to buy. It looks like all first editions have been sold. We have that large panoramic moonroof that I mentioned. There's a slider touch control right there for opening and closing it, although the glass does not actually open. We're just talking about the shade there. So if you're looking for an EV that has an enormous sheet of glass in the ceiling and a powered shade, this is going to be one of the only options. You can see motors right there, forward and backward. But as you can see, that opening doesn't extend to over the rear passengers' heads, and that's why it doesn't really have an impact on rear seat headroom. Using a huge sheet of glass in an EV is a trick that improves headroom and also allows you to have a very aerodynamic vehicle, but we don't have quite that same advantage here in the ID.4 because you can see that those areas right over where a passenger or driver's head would be, they're actually still restricted by the side of this opening. The driver and front passenger have height adjustable shoulder belts and height adjustable headrests. This is imitation leather upholstery. The base model has cloth upholstery. These are perforated but not ventilated. That is something that we don't see for some reason in too many EVs, and I'm always a little bit disappointed in that because ventilating the seat is going to be an awful lot more energy efficient than cooling the cabin. That's one of the reasons that we find heated seats in so many EVs, because that same thing applies when it comes to seat heating as well. These are a really comfortable seat design. I have to say that I found these seats a little bit more comfortable than the ones that we find in the Mach-E. We have pretty minor bolstering for the front seats there on the seat bottom and seat back cushion. This particular model has the two-tone interior, so you can see that white section right there that's really disrupting the color balance and white balance on this camera. There's also some ambient lighting going on behind it. Large door pocket down there at the bottom. That ambient lighting continues as we move on over to the dashboard. We have soft touch injection molded upper section right there. And then, as you'd expect out of an inexpensive EV, hard plastics lower in the dashboard right under that ambient lighting strip. The bin-style glove compartment was just barely able to accommodate a 10-inch iPad. Some larger ones wouldn't fit, but smaller ones definitely should be fine. In the middle of the dashboard, we have two different infotainment systems depending on the trim that you get. There's a base 10-inch screen, and then there is this optional 12-inch screen in the model that I'm driving today. Let's take a look at the factory navigation system because this is what a lot of folks have been asking me about. So I've set a destination for Los Angeles. Let's see how this goes. As you might expect, the vehicle has automatically added some charging stops, but we notice the same thing that I've seen other reviewers mentioning here, is that for some reason it's adding a DC fast charge stop that doesn't make a lot of sense. It's only a 50 kilowatt station, not a 150 kilowatt station, so that means this vehicle is going to take an awful lot longer to charge, 1 hour and 27 minutes. That's kind of an ouchie there. And it's not an Electrify America station. Neither is this one. Hopefully this is something that Volkswagen will fix via a software update, but personally I'd find that a bit of a flaw, especially since the vehicle has free Electrify America charging for 3 years. As you'd expect out of a new vehicle, it supports CarPlay, both wired and wireless. I happen to be connected wired. I like the fact that Volkswagen lets you choose. It's also really handy that they reserve this small portion of the screen for some system functions. So you can see the time, temperature, status of the built-in cell modem right there, the heated seats for the driver and front passenger. You could type that to get over to the climate control screens. And there's always a home button or close button over there on the left. Below that, we have some touch buttons. Not my preference here, so power button right there. You can slide for the temperature. You can slide around like that. You can also slide around for the volume. Now this is much better done than Honda's sliders, so I didn't have quite as much of a problem with this system, but with my dry fingers, sometimes it doesn't respond to me. Below that we have some more touch buttons. This one brings up the parking sensors and backup camera right there, a button to take us over to the climate control screen, hazard lights, a button to take us over to the assistant screen. This is where you can adjust the way some of the assistant systems work in the vehicle, and then a drive mode button here, Eco, Comfort, Sport, and Custom. Continuing down the dashboard, we have two large air vents there, an area where you can store parking cards, business cards, that sort of thing. Two large cup holders here. This section is removable, and you can see it's just sort of like a figure 8 or an hourglass figure right there. If you want to just use that area as cargo storage, you can do that. This is what the new key fob looks like. It definitely is a really elegant, nice design. I would expect to see this in an Audi, not a Volkswagen, to be honest. Behind that, we have a Qi wireless charging mat, some additional storage with some additional dividers right there. And as you can see, we have individual armrests for the driver and front passenger seats. There's a little button over here on the side, so you can adjust its height using that button. And if you want to hide your goodies, there is a roller-style shade to cover off this entire area. On the side of the steering column, we have an engine start-stop button, which is an interesting touch since this doesn't have an engine, and that it's not actually required, because if you want to start the vehicle, you simply hop in with the key fob and then put it in drive. You'll find the shifter over here on the side of the instrument cluster. This reminds me a lot of the BMW i3. For drive, we simply toggle it forward right like that. If you want neutral, you can just give it a quick little toggle and you can actually switch between the gears. You can see that over there on the instrument cluster, or just do a full toggle for reverse, full toggle for drive. So going back and forth is pretty easy. Park is a button at the end. The one thing that is a little bit annoying is that if you put the vehicle in park and hop out, say to open a gate or a garage door or something like that, and you hop back in, you basically have to start the vehicle all over again. Although the infotainment screen is pretty large, the instrument cluster is not. This is a 5.3-inch LCD. We have 3 different basic views there, one with a safety-centric view and one with a mapping-centric view. If you don't have mapping enabled, then you just have 2 basic views. As I said before, it moves with the steering column, but as you can see, the steering wheel actually hides that gear shifter right over there. The steering wheel is a round 3-spoke design with some minor sport grips up top. The buttons on the steering wheel are all touch buttons with haptic feedback. I found these a little bit trickier to use than I would like, but again, a little bit easier to use than what we find in some Hondas. The controls on the left side of the steering wheel are for the adaptive cruise control system, which is standard. Volkswagen's love for touch controls continues on the left side of the steering wheel, where we have touch controls for the headlights, the all-weather light there, and a nice touch is controls for the front defogger and rear defroster over here as well. So if the infotainment screen for some reason failed, or you just prefer quick one-touch access, this is a really handy feature. Not quite as handy are the touch controls on the driver's door. If I want to control the rear windows, you'll notice I only have 2 window switches here. I have to press rear first for a while. I have to press and hold it, and then I can control the rear windows. If that's not enabled, then these are just the front windows, but you do have to give it a pretty dedicated long press right there. If you just give it a tap, it's not going to do anything. Same thing applies to the door lock button there, and then this little knob is the mirror control, but also will control mirror folding and mirror heating. Out on the road, this has a peppy feel to it, but 0 to 60 times are not as quick as some of the EV competition. 0 to 60 happened in this model in just over 7.5 seconds. That's pretty similar to a wide variety variety of compact crossovers out there, and actually a little bit faster than something like the Nissan Rogue, right in line with something like the RAV4 Hybrid. But it is going to be slower than some of the plug-in hybrids out there, like the RAV4 Prime, or some of the EV competition, obviously like Tesla or the Mustang Mach-E. But to be perfectly honest, I don't think most folks will mind. This feels very much like your average compact crossover, except for the fact that this is rear-wheel drive, and it is noticeable because I like the way this drives out in your favorite winding mountain road. We definitely have a little bit more steering feel than we find in the average mainstream compact crossover, and the grip is better as well, but I'll talk about that in a bit. In the 60-0 stopping test, it took this model 112 feet to stop from 60. That's a pretty decent stopping time, considering the fact that this weighs about 4,600 pounds. Just under 4,600 pounds in the base model, just over 4,600 pounds as I'm driving it today. And there is no all-wheel drive version of this just yet. On the subject of grip, I'm really glad that Volkswagen gave this the staggered tire setup. So 255s in the back again, 235s up front. This is a good combination, and I love the way the ID.4 feels out on the road. Some people may be surprised by this, but this handles better than the Mustang Mach-E. The Mach-E is heavy, and it has some strangely skinny tires. 225 with tires bumped up to about 40 PSI. These definitely are more appropriate to the heft and just the size and everything going on in the ID.4. I prefer the way this is tuned, to be quite honest. Now, obviously, the laws of physics have to be obeyed, and this isn't going to handle as well as some of the lighter competition, but the ID.4 really does hold its own, and it has a nice feel to it. Now, let's talk about some EV-specific things. There's no one-pedal driving in the ID.4. Some folks are really upset about that for some reason. Honestly, it doesn't bother me at all, because I'm not a huge fan of one-pedal driving. Some people ask me why, and I think that's mainly because my right foot still works, and I can move my right foot from one pedal over to the other pedal and then slow the car down. My biggest complaint about one pedal driving is that nobody seems to be able to do it smoothly. Every time I've been in any car, regardless of whether it's a Leaf or a Tesla or a Mustang Mach-E or any EV with one pedal driving out there, and I'm a passenger, it just doesn't feel as smooth as if that same person is driving a car like this and then being forced to use the brake pedal for those braking maneuvers. It just ends up a smoother driving process. Ride quality is honestly pretty similar in many EVs out there. That's simply because of the tire size, the tire compounds, and the weight of the crossover. In terms of comparisons, this still has the sort of firm but bouncy feel that we see in other EVs, but I think that Volkswagen has managed to tune the ID.4 on the better side of things. So this definitely has a better ride in terms of soaking up the larger bumps and smaller imperfections out on the road than something like the Ford Mustang Mach-E. Efficiency is a little bit difficult to talk about because I haven't had as much time in the ID.4 as I would like. Over my usual EV test loop, which is a 60-mile drive loop that I use to test fuel economy, I was averaging 3.1 miles per kilowatt hour. That would give this a real-world range score of 240 miles, which is pretty close to the 250 miles EPA range. Obviously, if you're a little bit more gentle on the throttle, or you travel at lower speeds, or you're living in a really flat area, then your overall range is going to be a little bit better, a little bit closer to the EPA numbers. 3.1 miles per kilowatt hour is honestly pretty average for an EV at the moment. You'll find slightly better fuel economy in something like a Tesla Model 3 that is sleeker, it's sedan-shaped, but substantially similar economy in most trims of the Model Y, the Mach-E, the Jaguar I-Pace, and other EV crossovers that are about the same size as this. If you start driving at higher speeds or in hillier areas, then you will notice a bit more of a difference between this and some of those sleeker EVs like the Model Y or lighter EVs. Definitely keep that in mind. At 4,600 pounds, this is heavier than some of the inexpensive EVs that we find in the US at the moment. Bottom lining the ID.4 is pretty easy. I love the way that Volkswagen has decided to tune the chassis. I also applaud Volkswagen for making the base ID.4 rear-wheel drive and giving it pretty grippy and wide tires in the rear. It really makes it more fun than you might think. Certainly more fun than the average inexpensive EV currently available in America. On the other hand, this doesn't have the punchiness in terms of acceleration that we find in some modern EVs. So flooring it, the power builds. It doesn't just snap your neck back into place like we see in other EVs. That was probably done in order to help improve drivetrain lifetime and of course battery wear and tear as well. Although some folks have given the ID.4 a bit of a hard time for its curb weight and the EPA range figures, Volkswagen could have given this longer range if they had stuck some really skinny tires on here like we see in the Chevy Bolt or the Bolt EV or some of the Hyundai and Kia EVs that are currently on sale, but instead Volkswagen went in a different direction and gave this better handling, and I think that that balance is okay. Now to the nitty-gritty. How much is the ID.4 going to set you back? Well, this is going to start at $39,995 for the base model. They're calling that the Pro version. If you want all-wheel drive, $43,675. Remember that all-wheel drive in an electric vehicle like this doesn't just mean that some power goes to the front wheels. It means you get another electric motor and therefore better performance when you choose all-wheel drive versus rear-wheel drive. So the all-wheel drive model is going to be faster. It's going to be 302 horsepower. That base model is fairly well equipped. It comes with standard LED headlights, but not the ones that we have on this model. 19-inch wheels, 2-zone automatic climate control, cloth seats, and the smaller LCD infotainment system. At first glance, nearly $40,000 seems like an awful lot more than the average compact crossover in the US. But remember, this qualifies for the full $7,500 federal tax credit, something that you won't find on the Chevy Bolt or the Tesla Model Y because their tax credits have expired. And this will qualify for additional state and local incentives depending on where you live in the US. It also gets 3 years of DC fast charging, which is probably the biggest deal for the ID.4 period. And that's one of the things that I find most vexing about the ID.4 is that the plug-in charge at Electrify America stations, as I said before, does not work yet with the ID.4, but we have 3 years of DC fast charging. So if you're shopping for a compact crossover and you want something that's just about as practical as the Tiguan, the RAV4, the CR-V, but you want something that's electric and less expensive to operate, then this is certainly going to be in the running, because $39,995 gets reduced by $7,500 in the federal tax credit, thousands of dollars depending on where you live in your state and local area. You also get basically free fuel for 3 years, and even if you're charging this at home, plugging this in at home is going to be less expensive to operate than the average gasoline crossover. On top of that, remember to factor in reduced maintenance costs. There are no belts to replace. There is no engine oil to change because there is no engine. The transmission fluid in this vehicle, because it technically has a 1-speed transmission, is going to last the lifetime of the vehicle because there is incredibly little going on mechanically in an electric vehicle like this. Now, if you want something closer to the model that you've been looking at today, the Pro S is going to start at $44,495, all-wheel drive $48,175, and all of the first edition models, which is what this is, have been sold out. So you will not be able to find this exact model, but you will be able to get the Pro S version with essentially everything that this model has, and an illuminated Volkswagen logo on the front, which the first edition for some reason doesn't get. That's going to get you the steering headlights, the pano roof, the power tailgate, leatherette seats, no real leather in the ID.4, and the upgraded ambient lighting on the inside. Be sure and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already done so at the bottom of your screen. I will be taking a more complete look at the ID.4 just as soon as I possibly can. Hopefully by that point, the software will have been updated on this model to support things like plug-in charge and improve the infotainment system in the dashboard. Those are my main 2 complaints about the ID.4. But of course, my other complaint is the lack of a front trunk, because in an electric vehicle like this, it makes just an awful lot of sense to have a cargo area up front. Otherwise, there's a lot of wasted space in the ID.4, and that's something that we see in practically every other EV out there, including converted gasoline platform EVs like the Polestar 2 and the Volvo XC40. They've even managed to squeeze a small compartment up front where you could store smaller items like your charge cord. That's one of the things that I would really love to be able to keep in a front trunk like this, is the charge cord. If you go on a road trip to go visit a family member, maybe you don't know that there are charging stations along the way, but you know they have a dryer outlet or some other electric outlet that you could plug into. You could more easily keep that charge cord available and accessible while having stuff in the back. As far as price goes, we don't know exactly what the incentives will be like on the ID.4 going forward. However, we do know that Ford has been incredibly aggressive with the Mustang Mach-E. So even though the Mach-E seems like it would be a little bit more expensive than this, by the time you've calculated cash on the hood, it actually may be a little bit less expensive than the base ID.4. We just don't know exactly how these pricing realities are going to sort out just yet. The other direct competitor that comes immediately to mind and is available today is the Chevy Bolt. The Bolt seems like it's a little less expensive, but if you qualify for the full federal tax credit, then this is going to be less expensive than the Bolt. And either way, it's just a better vehicle. The ID.4 has a bigger cargo area, a bigger back seat, more comfortable back seat, a wider interior, a more spacious interior, more gadgets, more gizmos, etc. The only thing that the Bolt really has that the ID.4 does not have is their hands-off-the-wheel self-driving system, basically their version of Cadillac Super Cruise, although it doesn't seem quite as fully baked as the Super Cruise system that we see in the Cadillac Escalade. One last thing before I sign off, it's worth noting that if you decide to lease an ID.4, the lease rates are incredibly attractive. Now, if you don't qualify for the full tax credit, remember you have to have a minimum tax liability in order to qualify for that full tax credit. Be sure and consult your tax professional on that one. The lease deal on the ID.4 may be a good option for you, and you could always buy it after the end of the lease. The key thing to know is that the leasing company gets a tax credit from the federal government, so it doesn't just disappear into thin air. You don't get one, but the leasing company does, and Volkswagen passes the full $7,500 theoretical credit on to you. One of the reasons that this is actually a pretty good deal lease-wise is that leasing companies don't actually get the full $7,500 tax credit, so Volkswagen is obviously incentivizing their lease calculations a little bit there, making this a really, really sweet deal. And again, all the DC fast charging over the term of that lease is going to be included in that lease price. So whether you're shopping simply for an electric compact crossover or an inexpensive commute vehicle, you should definitely keep the ID.4 on your shopping list. But I would also say, definitely keep an eye on that Mustang Mach-E. Be sure and watch for that video. It's going to come out very soon. I'll be comparing this against the Mustang Mach-E that we recently bought for a long-term loan here at Alex & Autos. I'll see all of you later. Be sure and check out facebook.com/AlexandAutos where you can see what I'm driving this week. And of course, the merch store over at AOAmerch.com. I'll see all of you later.